Tonight is the yahrzeit of my mother, Revo Bas Rav Ze'ev Wolf, or as she was known in English, Mrs. Margaret Kesson. She passed away 2 years ago on Yud Ches Teves, the 18th day of Teves, Tov Shin Daled Mem, 5,744 years. I am dedicating this shiur to her memory, and may the merit of this shiur serve for the elevation of her neshama in Gan Eden. Now, tonight's lecture or shiur is a presentation on the topic of meditation. Now, the truth is, meditation is really a topic which is filled with a lot of ambiguity, a lot of vagueness. There's a lot of confusion in the area of meditation. Now, before I thought about giving such a presentation, I thought that the area of meditation wasn't as confusing as I now think it is. There are many books on it. People have presented lectures on it before. I thought that probably they dealt adequately with this entire area. This is what I thought. But when I perused the literature and I heard what people had to say, I realized that it really is a very confusing issue. And the truth is that in order to understand meditation, you really have to unravel a lot of areas. Now, the topic really needs a lot of clarity. One of the reasons why it is difficult to understand meditation is because prerequisite knowledge is not had by many people. So what they try to do is focus in on the area itself without really understanding a great deal before it. And as a result of that, they're confused. Now, in my thinking about the area of meditation, I realized that there are basically 4 areas. There are 4 areas or 4 difficulties that really have to be treated. In order to form a resolution about meditation itself, 4 basic areas have to be resolved. Now, what are these areas? Or rather, let's have another thought. If one does not resolve these 4 areas or 4 difficulties, which I'm going to mention, then true clarity or a real grasp or understanding of the area of meditation or actually mental states really can't be achieved. Your understanding is going to be incomplete and superficial. What are the 4 areas that I refer to? I've divided them in the following way. The first difficulty or confusion is what I call the conceptual confusion. The second is called the relationship confusion. The third area is called differentiation confusion. And the fourth is the historical confusion. And I'm going to be explicit now. All 4 of these areas need a clarification. If you get the clarification, then you really understand the framework with which meditation is integrated into, and clarity really gets achieved. Let's go back. The first area I mentioned was conceptual confusion or difficulty. With that, you can ask several questions in this area. What exactly is meditation? We hear all kinds of definitions or attempts to define meditation. What we have to have is a real working definition of what meditation is. We need a good definition, something that's precise. A next question in this area of confusion, or conceptual confusion, is that even if we understand what meditation is, how does it differ from other terms which are usually given over or mentioned as something similar to meditation? What do I mean? You have the word concentration. You have a word contemplation. Some people call it pondering. Some people call it deliberation. The question then is, what is the difference between meditation and these other terms? In fact, one can ask, what's the difference between meditation and just plain thinking? What exactly is meditation? How does it differ from the other areas? That's one thing, that's a second clarification that we have to achieve. A third clarification is that for the person who engages in it, what can it get for you? What does it achieve for the person? What are the outcomes or the consequences of meditation? Is it practical today? Can one actually use it? That is the third question under the major area of what is the conceptual understanding of meditation. Now, the next area which has to be talked about is what I call the relationship confusion or difficulty of meditation. Under that, we have several questions. What does meditation have to do with Judaism? We hear a lot about meditation, but what does it have to do with the Jewish religion? What is the connection between meditation and Judaism? We notice that mainstream Judaism ignores it completely, or else they just fail to acknowledge it. This is mainstream Judaism. It seems that only fringe groups of Jews actually are receptive to this area, or they bother engaging in it. They perhaps even practice it. But it's only those fringe areas. It is not the mainstream Judaism, and that bothers a lot of people. What does that mean? Even among those fringe groups that engage in meditation, they apparently are people who have had some kind of an exposure to Eastern religions, Eastern doctrine, or Eastern thought. They're the ones who seem to engage or think about or study meditation as regards to Judaism. In fact, the ones who seem to engage in meditation or study it are the ones who really had to do or who have studied a lot about the Eastern religions. And I mean especially those people who have been connected with or exposed to either yoga, for instance, which everybody's heard about, or Zen. These kind of areas, if a person has been exposed to it, he seems to be the one who thinks about meditation. And he seems to be the one who wants to connect meditation to Judaism. Actually, when you think about it, meditation clearly seems to be of Eastern origin. It comes from the East. Because the religions of the East prominently have meditation as a strong component of it. So then the question becomes, if it really is of Eastern origin, why contaminate Judaism with meditation? Why contaminate Judaism with something which is clearly foreign, with non-Jewish practices? That's another question that we have to ask. It's all part of the area of the difficulty of what is the relationship between meditation and other areas, particularly to Judaism. Now, on the other hand, if it relates with Judaism, then how? In what manner does meditation actually engage Judaism? We're assuming it does. What is the relationship between Judaism and meditation? In other words, what we're seeking then is some kind of a conceptual integration. What is a theoretical interface between meditation and Judaism? We've got to understand, how does meditation fit in the framework or the scheme of Judaism itself? How does it fit in the design of how does meditation fit into the design of Judaism? This is another question in that area. Now, furthermore, we can ask, again, if meditation is part of Judaism, then what are the goals or the objectives of meditation for Judaism? What does it do for Judaism, if we're assuming that it's part of it? What can it accomplish for Judaism? Or what does Judaism use meditation for, assuming it is part of Judaism? A last question in this area: how do the objectives or the goals which meditation achieves for Judaism, how do they relate with the goals and objectives of the other parts of Judaism? In other words, not only how does meditation relate with Judaism, but also in terms of conceptually, but how do the objectives which can be achieved through meditation, how do they relate to the objectives of other areas of Judaism? That's the next question. Now, in addition, in any case, we need a clarification of the exact relationship between meditation and other areas. This is a next difficulty. Now, the next area of difficulty or confusion is what's called differentiation. If in fact meditation is a real component of Judaism, in other words, it's really part of Judaism, then the question is, how does the meditative skill or meditative discipline, how does it differ from the Eastern one? In other words, if meditation is really part of Judaism in some way, which we'll take a look at later, then how does the meditative phenomena of Judaism differ from the same phenomena of the Eastern religions? For instance, yoga, which is actually presents the most prominent display of meditation. How does it differ from that? That's one question. How do we differentiate meditation of Judaism from meditation of the East? The second question is that besides asking how does meditation differ from Eastern, an interesting question is, how does Judaism view the results which are reported by gurus of the East? How do we view it? How do we understand the phenomena or the results of meditation that they say they achieved? How does Judaism understand it? How does it fit into the framework of Judaism? Do we say that these people, these yogis or adepts or anybody else who's doing meditation in the East, are they deluding themselves? They refer, for instance, to a phenomena called immense ecstasy, that if somebody meditates and he reaches a certain state of consciousness, which we'll talk about, one experiences tremendous ecstasy, tremendous feeling of exhilaration. What is that? Is that a Bob Meiser? Is that person really experiencing something? Or is it some kind of a delusion of some sort? They also say that they feel a union with the entire universe at that level. What is that? Is that also some kind of delusion? They say that they merge with what they call universal consciousness. What does that mean? In other words, what I'm asking is that how does Judaism view the actual phenomena, the results, which Eastern doctrine say that they experience as a result of meditation? What does Judaism say about it? That's another area that's important for us to know. The last area, which is a fascinating area, depending on how you deal with it, is what's called the historical confusion of meditation. If meditation is a part of Judaism, then the question is, why did it disappear? You obviously don't see meditation around anymore. For the very and as a proof of that, basically mainstream Judaism neglects it, ignores it, or refuses to acknowledge it. If it was part of Judaism, then why did it disappear? That's the first question. In other words, in the historical transmission of Judaism, why did meditation disappear? The second question in that historical confusion is that why is it that non-Jews possess it? Is there some kind of connection between the disappearance of meditation in Judaism and the emergence of meditation among the non-Jews, among the Goyim? Is there a connection historically? And the last question, or rather another question, if it was part of Judaism and disappeared, re-emerged or emerged to the non-Jews, will it ever appear again among Jews themselves? Will it become part of the orthodoxy of Judaism, the tradition of Judaism? That's another question, which I'd like to ask. So in other words, it is important to gain a historical perspective, because that tells you a lot of what meditation is and what part it plays in Judaism. And what I would like to do when dealing with the historical progression of Judaism and how it relates to meditation, to attack that area not externally, not via descriptions of this happened here, this event happened here, and so on, But I'd like to address that, what's called a pneumistic fashion, an internal understanding of the history of Judaism and why things happen the way they do, because that's going to be part of it. And meditation will be seen to be one of the phenomena which is manipulated and removed as a result of larger or more fundamental principles of the historical progression of Judaism. These basically are the areas that I want to cover. I've gone through all the difficulties, at least the ones I thought about what has to be clarified in order to understand meditation and the mental states of Judaism in general. If we approach meditation, mental states of Judaism in this manner, then we will reach a successful clarity, which you will see if you stick with it and you stay with it to the end. If we don't, if we leave parts out, then we're going to lose clarity. We're going to lose the understanding. You may understand some part of it, but you won't really understand it in a comprehensive way that really is understanding. And this is what I want to do. Now, in addition, I'm going to be going in sequence. Now, sequence is very important because the mind must have knowledge before it proceeds to further knowledge. That's the way it understands. If we jump and introduce something earlier when it really should be later, it's going to throw you all into confusion. And I don't want to be guilty of contributing to the confusion of meditation because of my poor ability to deliver a lecture. Therefore, I'm going to order things in sequence, and you will see that is the best way to approach it. Now, these are the confusions, the difficulties which have to be resolved. What areas will I cover in this presentation, in this shiur? The areas that I'm going to cover really have to be covered. Many of them are sequential, many of them are prerequisites to understanding meditation, to give you that comprehensive understanding of what meditation is. In order really to have a proper understanding or a real adequate resolution of the 4 difficult areas which I had mentioned previously, it requires a treatment or a presentation of these following areas. And I have 7 of them. Okay? The first area that I'm going to talk about is a fundamental grasp, or really a basic understanding of the internal structure of Judaism. This is what I'm going to talk about initially. In other words, what I want to present is a basic comprehension of major principles, major doctrines of the philosophical system of Judaism. This is what I want to cover. If we want to successfully, conceptually integrate meditation with Judaism, then we have to have a clear conceptual understanding of Judaism itself. This is what we have to do. In other words, if we want to understand meditation, we really have to understand Judaism. Now, I know people are going to say, well, I understand Judaism, but let's wait until I finish, and then you can ask yourself, is that what you understood about Judaism that is required to have an understanding of meditation? So that's the first area, a conceptual understanding of the basic principles of Judaism. This is what I'm going to go into first. The second area I'm going to go in is the task of man as viewed from this Judaic system. What is the task of man? In addition, we're going to be looking at what are the various components of the tasks. What are the various elements, what are those things which we have to do, which comprise the task? And of course, what we will eventually see is that meditation really is part of that structure of the task. Meditation is one of the components or one of the tasks which is part of Judaism. That's what we're going to see. Therefore, we have to study what is the task that Judaism says that we must do, that Jews have to engage in. We're going to cover that area. Now, the third area is the area of the structure of man. In other words, I'm going to go through important concepts of a person. What is the definition of self? What is a self? What is mind? What is a spiritual counterpart of self? What are the parts of self? And so on. In other words, what are the spiritual entities that comprise a man? One must understand that structure before he really understands the mechanism of meditation, because meditation does something to man himself. And in order to understand that, we really have to understand the structure of what an individual, what a human being is composed of, both self, mind, spiritual entities, and so on. And then we will understand the mechanism of meditation. This is the third area that I'm going to go into. The fourth area is what's called the meditative techniques. What is meditation? How is it done? And what does it achieve? And that's where I'll be defining meditation. When we've gone through the first three areas, we now can go straight into meditation and really understand it. What is meditation? How is it done? How does one do meditation? And that's where you can pick up in terms of how to do meditation. And lastly, what does the meditation that one does, what does it achieve? That's the fourth area that I'm going to try to cover. The fifth area is what's called Jewish meditation. In other words, what is meditation as it relates, as it interfaces with Judaism? Because meditation as a Jewish phenomena is different than meditation as an Eastern phenomena. So therefore, first I'm going to go into meditation techniques in general, which is common to all doctrines, and then we're going to focus in on Jewish meditation, or what is meditation as relates to Judaism. Especially, what are the outcomes of meditation as it applies to Judaism? What are the outcomes that happen in meditation, which is necessary for Judaism, which is different than the outcomes that happen in the other doctrines, other religions? The sixth area I'm going to cover is Eastern meditative theory and practice. We're going to go and study what exactly is yoga, especially Raja Yoga. What exactly is it? How is it differentiated from Judaism? And also, an interesting area which most people are not aware of, the Judaic origins of Eastern meditative doctrine. And that probably comes as a surprise to many people. But the truth is that Eastern meditation really derives from Judaism, which we will see. The vice versa. Not that we take it from them, but they really take it from us, and they took it, distorted it, and so on, which I will bring down. The last area I'm going to go into is the history of meditation, and explain the disappearance of meditation from Judaism, also its appearance among non-Jews, and why, because you will see that meditation appeared among non-Jews about the same time it disappeared from Judaism itself. And also the idea about the eventual emergence of meditation back into Judaism. These are the 7 areas that I want to cover in this year, in this presentation. If I'm able to do it, it'll give each one of you a good basic framework of 2 areas. First of all, it'll give you a very good framework, basic framework of meditation itself. You'll be able to integrate that which you read or see or hear from another person. If they talk about this area, you'll be able to integrate it in the framework that you develop here. And also, as a peripheral, many ideas in Judaism will be dealt with as we journey to cover the area of meditation. These are the areas that I'm going to cover. These are the areas that are necessary. And we are going to go through a wealth of ideas, as you will see. Very important ideas, very fundamental ideas. Now, it's going to be very intellectual. It's going to be a lot of ideas thrown at you in a short amount of time. So therefore, I have to ask that you pay attention and you follow it closely. If you have any questions, like I say, just feel free to ask. The first area that I'm going to talk about is the basic Judaic design of creation. As I had mentioned previously, I want to go into what is the fundamental structure of Judaism. What is the conceptual understanding of what Judaism really is? What are its main principles, its main ideas? And you will see that this will relate to meditation later on. Now, first idea I want to deal with is the purpose of creation. The purpose of creation is what? Well, God, the Ribono Shel Olam, what he has revealed to man in terms of why he created this entire creation, the word for it is hatova. The word hatova means goodness. What the Ribono Shel Olam has revealed to man is that he created the entire universe in order to be what's called meditative, in order to bestow some aspect of goodness on man. In other words, that man should experience some state of well-being, a state of pleasure, some state of goodness. This is the only reason why God created the universe, or the entire creation. And this is what he's revealed to man. Why he wanted to do that in the first place is not known to us, because we don't know what motivates God. God has no motives in that sense. But in terms of the immediate reason, the answer is hatova, the fact that the Ribono Shel Olam created the universe in order to bestow goodness or a certain state of well-being on man. That is the first idea. And that is really the most fundamental idea in terms of the purpose of creation. Now, the Ribono Shel Olam has made a decision. If he wants to bestow or give man a certain state of well-being, is he going to make men work for it, mankind work for it, or is he going to give him the state for free? For certain reasons which I'm not going to go into, God decided that what he wants to do is man has to earn this state of well-being, this state of goodness. Man has to earn it. Man must be responsible for it. It will not be given to him gratis, for free. In other words, man has to cause the state that he is in. If that is the case, then the state which he is in is called reward. Okay? Then it's called a reward, because the state of goodness, or the hatova, is in response to acts which he must do. So therefore, man awaits a reward, not merely a gift, an outright gift. This is what God decided, that the kind of state that man will have is a state called of well-being, but this will be a reward because it follows from acts which we must do. Now, in order for the Ribono Shel Olam now to set up this agenda, if he wants man to earn the reward or the state of well-being that he's going to have, then there are certain prerequisites that he must do. The first prerequisite is that he has to create a deficiency. He must create some kind of deficiency. That, then the task of man will be to remove the deficiency, because man has to have a task if he's to earn reward. So therefore, God has to create a deficiency. Based on the deficiency, man will now have a task. And if man does the task, then he will earn this hatova, this state of goodness, or this reward. Man will have earned it. Now, but in order for man to be involved in really being responsible for that state, he has to cause that state. Man therefore has to have free will. If a person has free will, then he is really the cause of what he does. If a person does not have free will, then he is not the cause. It is obviously God who is forcing man to do certain acts. So therefore, free will is necessary for man to possess in order that he should be the true cause of the achievement that he does. And what is the achievement that he does? That deficiency which was set up has to be removed. Therefore, man is given free will. Now, in order for man not to escape his responsibility of this task, because a person can say, well, look, I don't want to get involved. Leave me out of this. I don't want to be involved in doing what God has asked me to do. Not that he knows what God has asked him to do, but even if he does, what the Ribono Shel Olam wants, or what he has determined, is that in order for man not to run away from this task, then what he has to do is he has to create drives in man. What drives do to you is that they force you to act, because you cannot escape a drive. If you have a drive for pleasure, or you have a drive to do anything, you have an ego drive or whatever. You cannot escape that. You must fulfill it. It is very difficult. Those drives were placed in man in order to make sure that he remains in the arena called this world. You must do the task. And it is a very interesting study of how the drives exactly relate, or are the exact drives which man must have in order to force him into the exact task that a man must do. But that's not for now. But that is itself is an entire study, and obviously a great deal of psychological theory is based on why God created the universe. In other words, psychology, as viewed from the standpoint of Judaism, is based on this idea that the drives which are given to man are there for the sole reason of making sure that you will not run away from the task. They force you to engage in that task. What's important to understand is that you must choose, but what you choose is freely up to you. What the drives do to a person is they force you to choose because you have opposing tendencies in many ways. But what you choose is up to you. In other words, the freedom of not making a choice is not yours, or else, because then you would run contrary to the plan God wants. You must choose. You have no choice. What you choose is up to you. That's up to you. But you have no freedom of will in terms of not choosing at all. And God made sure that you're going to choose by implanting in your psyche many different psychological drives which force you to engage with this world and actually to go through what you have to do. Now, the question then is, what exactly is this task? What is the deficiency? And what is the reward? Because I've said that the fact that God wants to make man earn this state of goodness automatically dictates that he has to make a deficiency. He wants to give man a task which he will perform, and if man performs it, he will then earn reward. Besides that, man must also have free will, and he also has to have drives to make sure that he is in the arena. Okay, but this is very good in general terms. What exactly, specifically, is the deficiency? What is the nature of the task? And what is the nature of the reward? The drives I'm not going to go into, and certainly free will I'm not going to go into in this lecture. But the other three I want to examine because it's crucial to understand, especially in terms of meditation. And right now, it seems very far from meditation. What does this have to do with meditation? But you will see that all this is necessary to know before you understand what meditation is in Judaism. Now, so the question that I ask is, what is the deficiency? What is the task? And what is the reward? What's the nature of these ideas? And the answer to that is everything pivots. Everything can be understood around the nature of the reward. What the reward is determines what the task is and the deficiency. And we'll see why. Now, the reward that God will give takes place in Olam Haba. What is Olam Haba? Olam Haba is a Hebrew word or words. It's a term which denotes the future world. Olam Haba is the place where, according to Jewish thought, Jewish philosophical system, that is where the reward takes place that man will have earned. Now, there is a sefer called the Sefer HaBahir. It is a Kabbalistic text. It was written by Rebbe Nechonyo ben Hakoneh, who happened to have been a Tana, or one of those individuals who were involved in the writing or certainly espousing the views of the Mishnah. And that sefer says a very interesting idea, and it's also very fundamental. What is the term for the future world? And that term is Olam Haba. That is a term which means future world. But if you think of it, what does the word Olam Haba really mean? It doesn't mean future world. Olam Haba does not mean the future world. The word for future world means, for those who know grammar, is Olam Sheyavoy, the world that will come. Olam Haba means the world that came. Olam Haba means the world that came. So therefore, when we refer to the future world, We are not talking about the future world. We are talking about a world that came already. That's what Olam Haba really means, the world that came. Now, what is the significance of the fact that we refer to the future world as Olam Haba, the world that came, not Olam Sheyavoy, the world that will come? What that means is a very fundamental idea. It means that God created Olam Haba first, made it disappear, and then created Olam Hazeh. So when we say that we are going to get, hopefully, Olam Haba, what that means is that we are going to get the world that came and disappeared, and which will reappear in later times. That's what we are really referring to. In other words, Olam Haba means the world that came, disappeared, and will come again. So we refer truthfully to the future world, but the future world that was, disappeared, and will be. That's the future world that we refer to. Now, what that means is that the Ribono Shel Olam created Olam Haba first. He took Olam Haba and he changed Olam Haba into Olam Hazeh. Olam Haba is really Olam Hazeh transformed. That's what the Ribono Shel Olam did. He took Olam Haba, he changed it into Olam Hazeh, and later it will be changed back into Olam Haba. That's why there's only one world at a time, but depending on which phase you're looking at it, that determines what you call it. Olam Haba means the world that came. That was the first formation of this world. It was changed to this world, which is Olam Hazeh, and it will be again the future world because this world will be changed back into Olam Haba. Okay, so there are not two worlds. There is really one world going through different changes. That's the significance of what the Bahir says. That Olam Haba is really, or rather Olam Hazeh is really Olam Haba, the future world. And again, it's confusing because you use the word future world. But the world to come was really the world that came, transformed, and will be retransformed back into its original state, and then it will be really the future world. Now, in other words, Olam Hazeh is really Olam Haba transformed. It is not another place, but it's really here. In other words, if you ask yourself, where is the future world? The answer is that the future world is not in another place. This is the future world, but not in this plane or not the way we see it now. That's what it means. Olam Hazeh is really Olam Haba, but it's been transmagrified. It's been transformed. And Olam Haba is really here and not elsewhere. What has to happen is that Olam Hazeh has to be retransformed back into Olam Haba. Now, the task. So what we see, interestingly enough, is that Olam Hazeh is really Olam Haba transformed or disguised. That's probably a better word. When you disguise Olam Haba, it looks like Olam Hazeh. If you take away the disguise, it's Olam Haba. Now, of course, we're going to have to understand what is the disguise. How do you disguise Olam Haba? That's an incredible idea. But we'll see exactly how it happens. Now, we now understand what the deficiency is. What the Ribono Shel Olam did is he took Olam Haba and he transformed it, or he disguised it and made it Olam Hazeh. Okay? Therefore, we only have Olam Hazeh and not Olam Haba. Now, the task of man is, now we begin to understand the task. The task of man is to convert, to retransform Olam Hazeh back into Olam Haba. That is the task of man according to Judaism. Now, what will be the reward of man? The reward of man will be the Olam Haba that you transformed from Olam Hazeh. In other words, man will be responsible. Man will cause his own reward. If we bother converting Olam Hazeh back into Olam Haba, then we get Olam Haba. If we don't convert it, there is no Olam Haba, because the fundamental condition that was stipulated in the beginning of the creation is that Olam Haba must be the achievement of man, not the achievement of God. And that is called din, or justice, which is that's a different concept. But man must make Olam Hazeh into Olam Haba. Therefore, we will create our own Olam Haba through our own acts, and we will be responsible for it. If we don't do it, it doesn't get done. If we do it, then it gets done, and that's exactly the world that we will live in. Now, we now know what? We know now the purpose of creation, which is hatova, goodness, that God wants to give man a state of some kind of well-being, which we'll see exactly what that is later. But that's why God created the world. We also know that man has to earn this goodness. It will not be given gratis or by gift, for whatever reasons, which I'm not going to go into. The third idea is that we now know that in order to give man a task, a deficiency has to be created. And the deficiency which God created is Olam Hazeh. In other words, He created Olam Haba and made it deficient and made it Olam Hazeh. We now know that the task of man, and that means really the task of the Jew. Whenever I use man, it really means the Jew. And the reason why I use man is because at the beginning of creation, it was man who was supposed to do it, not Jews. That's why Adam Rishon is not Jewish. Adam Rishon was not a Jew. Adam Rishon was a man. God intended all mankind to be in Olam Haba, or to be engaged in the task of retransforming Olam Hazeh into Olam Haba. And God gave mankind 2,000 years to do this task. Mankind, however, refused. And in the ensuing time, there was the Mabul, the flood, and so on. The only one who picked up, the only one who bothered to begin this retransformation process was Avram Avinu. He was the only one. Therefore, God said, since you're the only one after 2,000 years who is doing it, I will now make a covenant with you, and I will tell you, and that's what really Bris Ben Absarim is. We're going to make an agreement between each other. You are going to get Olam Haba, you're the guy, and your descendants, if you do the task, which is to retransform it, which we'll get into. Therefore, it is now not mankind's task, it is now Jews' task to retransform. God, however, gave mankind a last chance when He gave out the Torah, because He gave, or however form He did it, but God gave a chance for all nations to change, to do tshuva, to accept the Torah. Had they done it, then all of them again would be involved in the task of man, which is to reconvert Olam Hazeh back into Olam Haba. They refused, so therefore the task now remains only to Jews. If a non-Jew wants to engage in the task, he must become Jewish to do it. Only Jews as a nation can do it. If non-Jews want to engage in that task, they must become Jewish. That's the way it works. Therefore, I use the word mankind because that's how it started out. However, now the task is uniquely only for Jews because of the original history of the situation. That was a brief, overview. Now, we know therefore that the deficiency is Olam Hazeh. We know the task is to retransform Olam Hazeh into Olam Haba. And we know what the reward is. The reward is Olam Haba itself. In other words, that man is responsible for and caused to exist. That is going to be your reward. Not only that, but you are going to get the exact amount of Olam Haba that you made effort to achieve. No more and no less. If you did a great job and you really worked at it, then you get an Olam Haba which is immense. If you didn't do such a great job, then your Olam Haba is far less. And we'll understand what that means. In other words, you decide the course of your future. If you work, you get Olam Haba, and to the exact extent of your efforts. If you don't work, you do not get Olam Haba, you get nothing. Actually, you get annihilated because then there's no other choice. You either get Olam Haba or you cease to exist. But if you don't work, if you do a lot of evil or whatever constitutes not transforming Olam Hazeh into Olam Haba, then the person ceases to be because he has not done what he really has to do. Now, the question is, what is the nature of Olam Haba? And how can this possibly be transformed into Olam Hazeh? That's really the next question that I want to ask. Exactly what is Olam Haba? Because we've spoken about it in general terms. And How is it possible to transform Olam Hazeh into Olam Haba? Also, how is it possible to transform Olam Haba into Olam Hazeh? Exactly how is it done? Now, the answer to this lies in the nature of the reward in Olam Haba. That is really what the answer is, and that is what we have to explore. Now, in order to answer the previous questions of what is the nature of Olam Haba, how can this possibly be transformed into Olam Hazeh, and how do we retransform Olam Hazeh back into Olam Haba? We have to know the nature of the reward in Olam Haba. Now, these are certain fundamental ideas which will serve as prerequisite knowledge for these answers. God is perfect, shlemus, perfect. Therefore, it follows that his actions are perfect. In other words, if God is perfect, then it follows that the actions of God are also perfect. God wants to be metiv. In other words, God wants to give hatova, which is goodness, or a state of well-being. Now, hatova is an act of God. So therefore, it follows that if God wants to be metiv, if he wants to bestow goodness, then it must be perfect. The goodness itself must be in the most perfect possible manner. In other words, this is what we call hatova shlema, perfect goodness. Now, what is the best and perfect goodness? The answer is that the best and perfect hatova which God can give is to experience God himself. Since in God lies all perfection, it follows that he would be the perfect goodness that a man could experience. But how can we experience God, or what aspect of God can we experience that we are able to experience? The answer is that the only midah, the only characteristic or trait of God that we can experience is what's called his yichudai, his absolute oneness, his total, complete oneness. Now, the concept of yichudai encompasses two profound ideas. And when we say the word yichudai, we mean always these two ideas. The first aspect of the term yichudai, absolute oneness, is that he is the ultimate source of all being and existence. Literally, everything emanates from him. All being, all existence emanates from him. In other words, they derive their existence, their very being itself, from him continuously. If God would not give his existence continuously, then all would cease to be immediately. Therefore, God has to have a constant input of his existence. Now, obviously, it follows that we are dependent on the Rabbeinu Shalom for everything, including our very existence per se. If God is the source of all being, then we are completely dependent on him for our very being. All facets of our being are dependent on him. That is the first idea that is included in the term yichudai, his oneness. In other words, that he alone is the source of all being. The second idea is even more profound, and it actually is probably the most profound idea that we can have of God, even though it's very hard to understand what it means. And that is that God does not have existence. Now that sounds like a very funny statement, but it's true. God does not have existence. He is existence per se. He is being itself. Therefore, he determines the form that reality takes. In other words, God is not part of reality. Reality doesn't generate God or determine what God is. But since God is existence itself, reality is part of God. He generates it. In other words, he determines what's called the existential form that he wishes to be. God is capable of creating an infinite variety of different existential forms. Now, an existential form is existence as we know it. In other words, for instance, one of the transcendental laws of being is that nothing can exist and not exist at the same instant in time. That's an existential law. It is impossible for this tape recorder to be and not to exist at the same instant in time. It's impossible. It is part of our existential framework that this is so. But must it be so? Is it possible that God can create existence where this tape recorder could be and not be at the same instant in time? The answer is yes. He wants this existential form to contain this existential law, for whatever reason is known to him. However, he can create an infinite variety of different universes, each universe having a totally different set of existential laws, and none of them are duplicated in the next universe. That is how awesome his power over existence is, because he is existence. Now, if God is existence per se, then what follows is a very important idea. He truly is or exists, since he is existence per se. In other words, since God is existence and not has existence, since he is being, he exists. We who have to be given existence do not exist, even after we have existence. Of course, the question is then, who is it that's saying shir tonight? We'll see in a minute. But that's really what it means, literally. God is, we are not. He is because he is ising, or he is existence. We are not because we do not have existence. We have to be given it. And the truth is that even after we are given it, we don't really exist. Not in the same way he does. In other words, even after we are created, we don't exist like him. In truth, compared to God, we don't exist at all even after creation. And you'll ask me, how do I know this? I'll tell you. Moshe Rabbeinu tells the Jews in Devarim, in Parshas V'Eschanan, he tells the Jews, Ata horeis lodas, you have been shown to know. Where have you been shown? At Har Sinai, the mountain of Sinai. What have you been shown? Ki Hashem hu Elokim, God is the Lord. Okay, Lord in that sense means he is the absolute master of all. Ein oignul vadoi, there is nothing but besides him. Now, Moshe Rabbeinu is addressing Klal Yisrael. He's addressing the Jewish nation. What does Moshe Rabbeinu say? What does he say? He says that you have been shown by God on Mount Sinai that he is the absolute master. That is the first thing you have been shown. The second thing you have been shown is Ein oid vadoi. Besides God, Ein oid, there is nothing else. Now, Moshe Rabbeinu does not say to the Jews, Ein oid kamoyu, there's nobody like God. He says, Ein oid vadoi. Besides God, there is nothing else. Now he's talking to Jews even after they're created. The fundamental idea then is that even after people have been created, there is still nothing that exists relative to God's existence. Now I'll give you an example, because the truth is it is impossible for us to understand it. It is impossible for any Nevuah, any created entity to understand that concept, because we do not understand what existence per se means. We have never seen a being that is pure existence. We have seen beings that have an essence. They have qualities, characteristics, and they exist. These qualities exist. In other words, they have an essence that has existence. We have never seen anything walk around that is pure existence. That is one of the reasons, by the way, why God is incomprehensible to anything outside of himself. He is incomprehensible to every created entity, including the highest angels. Nothing can comprehend it because everything has an essence that exists. He is the only thing that has existence per se and does not have an essence which is separate from his existence. Now, I'll give you an example in order to have some basic understanding. Can you imagine a person is dreaming, a guy lying on a couch and he's dreaming. And in his dream, he dreams that there's one guy talking to another guy. And the guy is saying to the other guy, hey, we're really only a figment of this guy's imagination, this guy who's lying on the couch. You know, if he wakes up, we disappear. That's what he says. In other words, we're only in his dream. In other words, between me and you, we exist. But between me, you, and him, we don't exist. We're a figment of his imagination. And if he ever decided to wake up, we would instantly disappear. That is about the best example I can give. We are people in God's dream. He is the dreamer, so to speak. If he wakes up, or he decides to divert his attention, an instant of time, we cease to be. That's the only example I can give, because it's not possible to explain it any other way. But it is possible, at least on some level, to understand. Ein od milvadoi, and I will tell you now, the greatest truth you can understand is Ein od milvadoi. There is nothing more profound than Ein od milvadoi. There is no greater understanding you can have of God than the fact that milvadoi, besides God, ein od, there is nothing else. Now, since he truly is, because he is existence per se, he obviously is the source of his own being. Existence needs no source, it is. That's what existence is. We who are not, we who must be given existence, we must be created. But obviously, even after we're created, we are not the same as him. Now, he therefore is absolutely independent for his existence from anything outside of himself, because he is existence per se. That is the basic fundamental structure about God that I want to introduce. The concept of Ein od milvadoi, that besides God there is nothing else, even after creation. And the second concept, or rather it was the first that I introduced, is the concept that he is the source of all being, literally. Now, that is called, what I had mentioned, yichudoi, the concept of his absolute oneness. Okay, now, once we understand that, we now can understand the reward in Olam Haba. The reward in Olam Haba is the experiencing or the comprehension of these two profound ideas, literally. That is the place that we experience yichudoi. What does that mean? We experience two ideas: that he truly is existence itself. In other words, he truly exists. He truly is alone. In other words, in Olam Haba, we literally come in contact with God to such an extent where we feel that he is being. And the second idea is that he is the ultimate source of our being, of all reality. What does that mean? It means in Olam Haba, you experience God internally, not externally. Somehow you get more in contact with the ultimate cause of you, self. Now the ultimate cause of self is God. In some way you emanate from God, but we don't see that now. In Olam Haba, we feel God literally as ourselves, or we feel him as emanating, or we feel ourselves as emanating from him. And in that experience, we realize that he is our source, number one. And number two, we realize that he is being per se. Somehow that experience comes in a package with these two ideas. Now the byproduct of that, when you realize the ultimate cause of your being, in other words, it is where self knows the ultimate cause of itself, the well-being is infinite. Somehow we get a certain state of pleasure or well-being, whatever you want to call it, which is not describable in human terms. In other words, when man knows himself, then he comes into a state of indescribable well-being, goodness or pleasure, which is not comprehensible in human terms. That is what Olam Haba is. But you do not know it externally. You know it from within self. Now, this comprehension of the oneness of God, that he is alone, in the sense that he really is the only thing that exists, and that he is the source of our being in the relationship of a dreamer to the dream. This is called Yichud Mitziusai. The Yichud Mitziusai means the absolute oneness of God in terms of his being, that God is absolutely one in his being. That's called Yichud Mitziusai, that his Mitzius, his existence, Yichud, is that of a being that is absolutely one. In other words, he's the only one that exists. There's nobody else. That's why it's called Yichud, one. One means literally one. Nothing else exists but him. And in Olam Haba, we will experience this most fundamental truth in all creation. And that's really what it is. The most fundamental truth in all creation is Yichud Mitziusai, the comprehension that he is the only one that is, and he therefore is the source of our being, on the level of a dreamer to his dream. That is called Hasogas Yichudoi, the comprehension that God is absolute oneness. What do we see therefore? We see therefore that Olam Haba is not a place, it is an existential state. It's a existential plane or dimension where this Yichudoi, this comprehension of his absolute oneness, is totally apparent and revealed. That is called Gil Yichudoi. In other words, Olam Haba is a plane of existence where we are in direct confrontation with the source of our being. Gil Yichudoi is what exists in Olam Haba. Gilui means the revelation. Gil Yichudoi, the revelation of the absolute oneness of God, is the existential plane of Olam Haba. Therefore, we are Masig Yichudoi. Since the state is Gil Yichudoi, since in that state of Olam Haba, his absolute oneness is plainly revealed to all residents of Olam Haba, we therefore comprehend that oneness. We have Hasogas Yichudoi. In other words, Olam Haba is not a place, but it is rather a state or a dimension where God's absolute oneness is completely perceived by any being in that plane. Now, let us go further. Now, in other words, Olam Haba is a place where the relationship of God to his creation is revealed. Now, what did God do? That is Olam Haba. What God wanted to do now is conceal this relationship because he wanted to create a deficiency. So what he did is he concealed his absolute unity. And here comes another term. He was mastir his yichud. Hester means concealment. Hester means concealment. Olam hazeh is a state of hester yichudoi, where the oneness of God is concealed. Therefore, the state became Olam hazeh. In other words, Olam hazeh, or this world, is an existential plane where the yichud of God, God's yichud, is completely occluded, it is concealed, it is opaque from an entity in that plane. That's what Olam Hazeh is. Therefore, Olam Haba is an existential plane where there is Gil Yichudoi, the revelation of the oneness of God, and entities in that plane are Masig the Yichud, comprehend that oneness. And Olam Hazeh is an existential plane where there is Hester Yichudoi, where the unity or the oneness of God has been concealed from entities in that plane. And therefore entities in that plane do not see God in that way. What then do they see? I'll tell you. When there is a state called Olam Hazeh or Hester Yichudoi, which means concealment of divine, of God's oneness, then what entities in that plane, what they do is they see themselves as independent beings from God. All of a sudden they feel as if there's me and there's God. That's assuming that they see God. In Olam Hazeh, you do not even see God. All you think is that you exist and God does not exist. There are levels of concealment. But Olam Hazeh is a place where you actually feel as if you are somebody independent of God. You actually feel as if you are an independent being from God. Not only that, but you see other beings, and other beings are independent of God. In other words, when God conceals his oneness, what results? Multiplicity and plurality of beings. Because that's the opposite of oneness. When God wants to hide himself, you know what he does? He doesn't hide himself behind a tree. When he hides himself, what does he hide? He hides the concept of his absolute oneness. The fact that he is being in itself. And everything is dependent on him. When he wants to hide himself, what he does is he creates beings that think that they are somebody. That's how he hides himself. He hides himself in that illusion. So therefore, if you walk away thinking you're somebody, then you know God has succeeded admirably. Because that is how he does it. He hides himself when you think that you exist independently. When you think you're somebody. In other words, God hides behind plurality and multiplicity of beings and forces. In other words, if God is the only thing that exists, then obviously he's the only being that can cause. He's the only force that can do. When you think you can do independent of God, that's another way God hides himself. So therefore, the way God hides himself, again, very important, is not by concealing a physical thing or his spiritual nature or whatever he is, because he's none of these things. What he does is he conceals his oneness, and the way he does that is by creating the illusion of beings that think that they are independent of him and that they are independent causal agents besides God. That is how God hides himself. And the more God wants to hide himself, the more man thinks he's somebody. And that, the truth is, that is a terrible state for man to be in, that he should think he's somebody. Because that means that the deficiency is much greater. Now, therefore, we see that God's concealment of who he truly is the deficiency that man has been placed into. That's the deficiency. God created Olam Haba first, which is an existential plane where his relationship with creation is plainly revealed, and that is Yehudah, that he is being and that he's a source of anything outside of himself. He concealed that, and therefore Olam Haba became Olam Hazeh. So the deficiency is what God created, and he created the deficiency by concealing his true nature. That is Olam Hazeh. Man's task, therefore, is to realize God's true relationship to man. That is the job. You have to figure out that behind all this illusion, who God really is. In other words, you have to figure out that he is the source of your being and of all beings. Now, let's assume you figure that out. So then what will your reward be? Your reward will be that very comprehension of God that you figured out. You see, it's an exact, beautiful, simple equation. The deficiency is the absence of the oneness of God's presence. The task is to figure out who God is. And the reward is the revelation of what you try to figure out. You, no more and no less. You will get in Olam Haba the exact amount that you figured out in Olam Hazeh. That's all you get. Not one drop more. In other words, if you fooled around, you had a great time exercising self and thinking that you do everything, you just made a fortune on the stock market and so on, or you are the cause of your wealth, your power, and other pleasurable states, then you will be in a shock in Olam Haba, because you will get much less of Olam Haba. Because in Olam Haba you will get much less of the revelation. If you, however, endeavored and tremendously tried to figure out who he is, and we'll talk about how to do that, what's the instrumentation, then you will get that gilui, that hasaga in Olam Haba. Therefore, everybody in this room, everybody in this universe differs in terms of his state in Olam Haba. You get the exact amount of revelation that you worked for in Olam Hazeh. No more and no less. That is true justice. Now, we therefore see a beautiful equation. The reward is the very hasaga, the very comprehension of the oneness of God in Olam Haba that you worked for, in exact proportion to your achievements, to your efforts in Olam Hazeh. Therefore, we see therefore that the deficiency is Hesti Yechudai, the concealment of the oneness of God. The reward is the comprehension, the Hasagas Yechudai, the comprehension of the oneness of God. We see that the state of Hesti Yechudai is what? Is Olam Hazeh, and the state of Gili Yechudai, of the revelation of the oneness of God, is Olam Haba. Man's task is to convert his existential plane of Hesti Yechudai, Olam Hazeh, to another existential plane of Gili Yechudai, the revelation of God's oneness, which of course is Olam Haba. This process whereby you convert Hester to Giloi, concealment to revelation, is called Tikkun. The word Tikkun means rectification, restoration. Of what? It is the restoration of creation, the Bria, to its former status, where the absolute oneness of God was totally revealed. Thus, man's task is to masakin creation, to restore creation from a state of Hester to a state of Giloi, revelation of the oneness of God, which originally was at the beginning of the creation. That is why Olam Haba means the world that came. It was the first state that was created, the state of Gil Yehuda, which means the state of the revelation of God's presence. Therefore, the tikkun of Olam Hazeh, the rectification or the restoration of Olam Hazeh, is to retransform it into Olam Haba. Now, to reiterate, because it's very important, the four fundamental ideas which are revealed in Olam Haba, I mentioned two, but I'm going to elaborate on four. These four ideas are, all four ideas are revealed in Olam Haba. That is the plane of Gil Yehudai. One, he is existence per se. In other words, he does not have existence, he is being itself. Two, therefore, he truly is. He really exists. In other words, only a being that is existence itself truly is. We who do not have existence ain't. Now, included in that is, therefore, we who must be given existence must be part of him or really him. Think of it. If he is existence itself, therefore, every aspect of us is really him, because we have to emanate from him. We are part of him, because nothing about us can be unless he is there. So if you think about it, we are really him. Except we don't see that. In other words, again, if he is existence per se, it's not enough to say we have been given existence and all of a sudden we break away from him. No, everything about us is him, because nothing would be without him being there, because it wouldn't exist. Therefore, we are really him. Therefore, only he is, even after creation. That's why he's the only one that is, because we are totally immersed in his being. Therefore, after everything is said and done, he is the only thing that is, not we, except by some incredible act which we have no comprehension of how it was done. We came into being and we exist independent of him, so we can look at him and say that I am me and you are you. We don't understand how that is existentially possible, because we do not exist, because every part of us is him. So then what are we? We are not. But we don't know how that happens. In other words, the act of imparting existence or himself to bring others into being is a fundamental mystery. We are totally him. So if you want to know where is God, the answer is here. And that is the truth. He's here and he's here. Because this could not exist if God wasn't here to give it being, you see. Therefore, he is all over. That's why it says, Mole kol haaretz kavoidoi. The entire earth or all creation is full of his glory. Why? Not because God wants to be there, because if God wasn't there, it wouldn't exist. Therefore, he must pervade existence. But the incredible mystery is, how did he pull it off without we realizing who he is or that he's part of us? That is a fundamental mystery that we do not know. Therefore, but we do know that he is and we are not. Again, our relationship to him is a relationship of a dream to a dreamer. That is the concept of Ein Oid Milvadoi, that he is existence per se, that he is the only thing that exists. But now you understand why. Because there is nothing that has an existence outside of him, or it wouldn't be. So we are totally him. And how we exist is unknowable. And if you want to understand, if you want to think that you are the only ones that have this question, fear not. Moshe Rabbeinu had the same question. And Moshe Rabbeinu asked the Rebbeinu Shalom, if you recall when the Jews sinned at the Chet of the Egel, the sin of the golden calf, so God said, I will forgive Jews, and Moshe Rabbeinu knew that it was a very propitious time for him to ask God of something, to ask something of God. So he asked him something. And you know what Moshe Rabbeinu asked him? Moshe Rabbeinu asked him the two most fundamental questions in all reality. If you know this, you know everything. If you don't know this, you know nothing. And of course, Moshe Rabbeinu knew what to ask once he was given the choice. It's like Aladdin and the 3 wishes. He had 2. And he zeroed in on what he knew is the only thing that has any meaning. What did he ask? Hareini no es dirochecho. Show me your ways. Tell me exactly why you do what you do. In other words, since all creation is nothing more than the acts of God, if I know why God does everything, I know the purpose and the ontological structure of everything that is. It's an incredible way of total knowledge. Because the answer to the underlying rationale of God's actions is the explanation for all being. So therefore he asked, Hareini no es dirochecho. Show me your ways. Show me your anhagas, your conduct. Why do you do what you do? And so the Rebbeinu answered him whatever he answered him. But Moshe Rabbeinu knew he had a second wish. So he asked the greatest question that can ever be posed to God. What is that? Hareini no es kivodecho. Show me your glory. Who are you? Kavod means honor and glory. But that's really not a real good translation. What kavod really means is being. Because the glory of a being, the glory of a thing emanates from its being. What Moshe Rabbeinu asked the Rebbeinu Shalom is, show me who you are. And what he really wanted to know is, how can I exist independent of you? Who are you that I can exist independent of you when we both know that I don't exist? How is it possible? And God answered him whatever he answered him. Anyway, I just wanted to show you that if you were bothered by these questions, Moshe Rabbeinu was also bothered, and he fortunately had the opportunity to get it answered. Now, this is the concept of Ein Oid Milvadoi. Now, the third idea is that, therefore, if he is being, and he is the only being, then he obviously is that also the source of all being after he created being, which exists to him as a dream does to its dreamer. He is the source of all being, literally. Therefore, or rather, all 3 ideas are included in the term called Yichud Mitziusoi, the absolute oneness of his existence. Now, there is one more idea which we see in Olam Haba, but we also see it in Olam Hazeh, especially in the Messianic times. And that is called Yichud Shlitosoi, that God is the absolute master of all, which obviously follows. If He is the source of all being, then obviously He is the absolute master or controller or director of all being. Because whatever you do, He must agree with and give existence to your direction, or else you couldn't do it because it wouldn't exist. In other words, He is the absolute master or total master of all being. This is called Yichud Shlitosoi, that God is absolute master of all creation. And in the Messianic times, this especially will become apparent to all of us. God will then reveal that He is the absolute master. And the interesting thing about it is that God has to give existence to an individual that wants to do against God's will. Because how could the person do against God's will if he doesn't have existence independent? So God, Nevuah, has to give existence to an opposing will, so somebody can then do contrary to God's will. Because it wouldn't exist if God didn't give the person or enable the person to form an opposing will. Anyway, that's an interesting idea. This is the basic internal conceptual design of creation according to Judaism. It's very basic and very fundamental. It includes those ideas. We now see that the deficiency of creation is Hesti Yechudai, and that is Olam Hazeh. The task of man is to reconvert Olam Hazeh into Olam Haba, which means to figure out who God really is, and the end product, which is the reward, is the Olam Haba, which man himself earns and is responsible for later on. Okay? This is the basic fundamental structure of Judaism. Now, before I go to the task of a Jew according to this design, because we now know what the deficiency is. We know the deficiency is concealment of God's oneness. We know what the reward is, which is the comprehension of that oneness. So before I go to the task of a Jew according to this design, I want to clarify Olam Hazeh in more detail. And we know what Olam Hazeh is in general. It is a place, or it is an existential plane where the absolute oneness of God is concealed. That is Hesti Yechudai. Now, I will tell you something interesting. There is not one existential plane of Hesti Yechudai, but there are four of them. In other words, God concealed the relationship that He has with the universe 4 degrees, 4 levels. Therefore, Olam Hazeh consists of 4 levels. Each level is called an Olam, a universe. Each one is called an Olam of Hesti Yechudai. It is called a world or an Olam where Hesti Yechudai, the concealment of His oneness, is present. Okay? In fact, do you know where the word Olam comes from? The word Olam comes from the word Helem, which means concealment. The word for world or universe itself, which is Olam, means concealment. Because that's really what an Olam is. In other words, if you want to know what the fundamental attribute that you have to know in this world is, know that God conceals Himself in a certain degree. That's all you have to know. That's really what Olam Hazeh is. Olam Hazeh, this concealment. Okay, so we know therefore that there are 4 levels of that concealment. Now, what God did is something very interesting. He created 4 concealments. In other words, He concealed aspects of Himself 4 times. Each world is a greater concealment of who He is. In other words, the descent, as you go down from world to world, okay, it yields greater opaqueness or greater occlusion of the transparency of the divine essence. That's what it does. What is occluded or opaque? The fact that God is the source of all being and that God is Ein Vadoi, because it always comes together. In other words, There are four worlds, four levels or existential planes of concealment where the divine essence or the transparency, the revelation of that essence is concealed. Now, all olamas, therefore, all worlds or all universes or all existential planes, they all mean the same thing. They all pivot or they all revolve around this principle: the degree of transparency of the divine essence, or the degree of revelation of the yichud of the Rebbeinu Shalom. In other words, it's gil yichudoi. Now, the variations in the degree of transparency, or the variations in the revelation, or the degree of revelation, determines a particular existential plane or a particular dimension of being. Now, what does Hester Yehude manifest itself? And that's the thing that's going to change in the four levels. And I had mentioned this previously. When God conceals himself, the manifestation of that concealment as we experience it, the expression of that hiding as we experience it, is several. The first is that we have a sense of I. We actually feel I. In other words, we feel I am independent from God. We are independent beings from God. That's what we feel. But that is an expression of Hester. Remember, never be fooled. The second idea of Hester, or the expression of Hester, is that we have the perception of other independent beings from God. In other words, we perceive not only that we are independent of God, but that there are other beings also independent of God. And the third manifestation or expression of Hester is that we perceive that there are many different causal agents or forces, all independent from God. In other words, God is not the only entity or being that does. We do too. In other words, this can be summed up in a Hebrew expression called ribui koichis umetzius. The multiplicity, which is ribui, or plurality, of koichis, forces, causal agents, umetzius, and beings. In other words, the expression of Hester Yechudoi is called ribui koichis umetzius, the plurality or multiplicity of independent forces and beings, independent of God. That is the way we feel his concealment. And as I had mentioned previously, that is the way God conceals himself from us. He hides himself in that illusion. Now, the manifestations of Hester Yechudoi, as it appears in the different worlds or ilamas, is these expressions, but in varying degrees. In other words, instead of saying there are four levels of concealment of God's essence, I can also say that there are four levels of yichud manifestations, that there are four levels of oneness manifestations, which is the opposite of concealment, which is of course a result of the Hester levels. In other words, God conceals himself, thereby what is left? What is left is a particular amount of revelation of who he is. He conceals himself more. What's left? A lesser degree of revelation of God. So every time there's a Hester, there's a resultant Giloi. But the Giloi is different at different levels. In other words, there are four levels of Hester, or concealment of God's presence. Therefore, what is consequent to it is that there are four levels of Yichud manifestations, or revelations of his oneness. In other words, therefore, a being which exists in any one of these worlds, there are four levels of the hasaga of this Yichud. So, there are four levels, or four worlds, existential planes. Four levels of Hester, concealment, which means gives rise to four levels of hasaga of the Yichud, revelation of this, rather gilui of this yichud, revelation of this yichud, which means that there will be only four levels of the comprehension of that yichud. One follows from the other. That is basically the idea. Hester, concealment, gives rise to only a certain amount of gilui, revelation, which then means that only a certain amount of yichud, oneness, will be apprehended or comprehended by the beings in that plane. And each level is called a world or an existential plane, and there are 4 of them. There is really 5, but I am not going to talk about the 5th or the highest, because the highest is called Odom Kadmoin, and I will be talking about that in a subsequent shir. But I will be only talking about these 4 levels. And these 4 levels, since they have Hester, are 4 levels of Olam Hazeh, which is very important to know. Olam Hazeh consists of 4 levels, not 1, but 4, and it's all Olam Hazeh.